Hello and welcome back to week 11, independent film era. So this is the era in the early 90s, coming out of the Reagan Bush 80s. Okay. And we start to see a change in the culture, in the tastes, in the music, which comes in with grunge in the early 90s, 92, which really changes music and kind of kicks off a new aesthetic and feel to the 90s. In 1990, there were a tremendous amount of movie flops. Hollywood was pursuing the franchise model that had started in 1989 with Batman. They're making sequel after sequel. So, like RoboCop 2 completely bombs at the box office in the early 90s, along with a few other similar type films. And this kind of creates a little bit of a window, an opening for what became known as the independent film era. It didn't happen overnight. It built gradually, starting in the late 80s with a lot of those underground films we covered in 80s Undercurrents. So I'm talking about Spike Lee, Do the Right Thing, and of course, Steven Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which breaks through in 88, 89 at the Sundance Film Festival. And Sundance goes on to become a very important vehicle where independent filmmakers can meet up with producers and get funding to finish the film, or really the distribution to release it to wider audiences and theaters. And that's where the mid-majors like Miramax came in. Miramax was also very helpful to another independent filmmaker that started in the 90s, Quentin Tarantino. They helped finance and finish his film Pulp Fiction, bringing it to wider audience and huge worldwide acclaim. And that's the film that really changed Hollywood. It's a monumental film in Hollywood history because of it brought in a whole new aesthetic, a whole new style of dialogue, the way dialogue was written. It, of course, made Tarantino a star, it revived the career of John Travolta, good or bad. So, really huge film, and emblematic of the independent era and the aesthetic, which was one in which you had an auteur who usually didn't go to film school. Let's remember, a lot of these guys were a lot younger when they broke into the industry. This is also about the availability of home video equipment. So they began making movies of some sort on video from teenhood, and writing, of course, in the case of Tarantino. So a lot of these films have a different aesthetic. It's very dialogue heavy, a lot of clever ideas, usually about a lonely outsider, something unusual, or some weird subculture is explored. This is all what independent films of the era were about. They were low budget, they looked and felt different than Hollywood films, and this is how a lot of directors broke in, and they had the later success that we now know. So I'm talking about people like Wes Anderson, Christopher Nolan, Richard Linklater. The list is long of names of directors you might know who have made great films. And the films they make now aren't independent. They have financing sewn up ahead of time, or even some are even made for major studios, like Batman for The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan. However, they originated in this time, and there are tours, and that's an important thing to think about with the independent era. A lot of these are auteurs; these are directors who have a vision. So as we come into the 90s, we're going to see Sex, Lives, and Videotape, actually made in 1988. I sort of included it in the independent film era because it kicks it off with Sundance. Then we have Pulp Fiction, 1994. Then we have The Player, 1992. Now, that film isn't so independent, a little independent, 50-50. But actually, that film really captures what was going on at Hollywood at the time, which was really what was going on in America at the time. The hangover from the 80s, the corporatization of America, where you have the big money players who want to buy and sell companies and make low risk, high reward type, mass appeal type movies. They start to flood and invade Hollywood. And we're going to see that all throughout the 2000s as well, and really take over the machinery of making movies. And it changes movies because of what they want to try to accomplish, not as filmmakers, but as businessmen. Okay. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with Fargo, made by the Coen brothers, who were great independent directors, came up through the early 90s. By Fargo in 96, they've kind of broken through. This is their breakthrough film, nominated for several Oscars, including Best Picture, but won for actress and script. So kind of their breakout film, and another breakout film for independent films of the early 90s. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Lots of other things to cover. We'll also see the early introduction of CGI. The early DVDs break in next week around 95, 96. technology is starting to come in, starting to affect movies. We started to see CGI in films like Forrest Gump and so forth. But really, this era is about the independent films that were going on, that were changing Hollywood and bringing fresh voices. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. Next week, we'll talk about dystopian films. That's week 12. And then, of course, we also have a quiz coming up. So do get ready for that. All right, reach out with any questions. Adios.